Hi there. This is Aisha Salman, ASA's Business Intelligence Analyst. Today, ASA's Chief Economist, Dr. Kuehl, is conducting his second in a series of 3 webinars, taking a look at the economic landscape amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. In these volatile and unpredictable times, we are trying our best to keep our members informed and up to date. The pandemic situation changes every day. We are now at 13,000 deaths and counting. The number of unemployment claims has hit close to 7 million. Can we say that we are turning a corner for the worse, or is there a silver lining somewhere out there? In today's webinar, Dr. Kuehl will shed light on if the virus is fading and if we are getting past the immediate economic blow. There is no one better out there to educate us on this except Dr. Kuehl, who has a doctorate in political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet and Asian studies. He is also a co-founder of the Armada Corporate Intelligence and is the chief editor for the Business Intelligence Brief and one of the primary writers for the Black Owl Report. Today's webinar will last 40 to 45 minutes. At the end, we will open the floor to questions and answers. Please post your answers in the chat box on the GoToWebinar window towards the bottom. We will get to as many questions as possible today. As a reminder, Dr. Kuehl will conduct his last webinar next Wednesday, April 15th. Please be on the lookout for registration information. And also be on the lookout for a short survey, which I will be sending shortly after this webinar is over. Your feedback is encouraged. And now, Dr. Kuehl.
All right, thank you very much. And round 2, it would be nice if we could begin this by saying it's all over, everything is great, the virus is gone, big fake out, April Fools. Well, unfortunately, we're not at that point. But there are positive signs, and we're just going to have to kind of make the most of what is positive, try to deal with the negative. One of the comments that came from the last set of discussions was more focus on what's going on with your industry. And we'll try to do that, or I'll try to do that. The challenge right now is that statistics are having a hard time catching up with reality. We sort of have a sense of what's happening in a lot of the sectors because there are anecdotal stories from people that are in the business, but we don't really know yet how representative those stories really are. And particularly in an industry as diverse as this one, you touch so many different parts of the economy. There are those that are highly engaged with construction. There are those that are highly engaged with manufacturing. Some of the hard hit sectors, which include entertainment and the airlines and anything to do with tourism, well, that's going to catch a lot of this industry as well, and they've been hitting very hard. So as we work through these comments, we'll try to keep the sectors in mind, and at the very end, I talk a little bit more specifically about where construction fits into all this. But feel free to ask questions for clarification. As Aisha mentioned, we're going to do some of those at the end of the session, but be aware that you can also send me an email at any point. My email is on every slide, and feel free to send me questions, comments, ask for observations. We can do a lot of this stuff later offline when it occurs to you. So last time we met, we talked about the black swan. It's there, looking a little more menacing than it did before. And not to belabor the point, but we are now going to start talking about the aftermath, probably not right away, but by the time we get into the summer months, there's going to be a lot of conversation about what we've learned, what we need to do to protect ourselves should something like this happen again, because we know that something like this is going to happen again and again and again and again. We have been dealing with these viral attacks of one kind or another for decades, and we have been prepared for some of them. We have been woefully unprepared for others. This was not one that we were particularly prepared for. A lot of mistakes made early, and we're paying the price for those mistakes now. There have been a lot of different approaches in different parts of the world, which we now have an opportunity to learn from. We can do things that they did that were successful. We can avoid things that they did that weren't successful, but we'll talk about that as we go. So far, my advancer isn't advancing, but I can do it this way. So what do we know this very minute? Kind of what we did last time was sort of an update of sorts. The market volatility that was marked a month or so ago has calmed slightly. The markets are now behaving like they always do. They see something that's encouraging and they get all excited for a day, then something discourages them and they fall again. This week has been a little more encouraging. Activity in Europe has been buoying the markets a little bit. We'll talk about that in a minute. The supply chains out of Asia have mostly recovered, not yet in Europe, but there are some signs of progress there too. And this was a big issue for people in the supply business because your sector got hit right from the outset because of the supply chain crisis in Asia. That now is becoming a little more manageable. A lot of the opportunity is back. A lot of the companies that were shut down in China, South Korea, elsewhere are now back and functioning again. So the supply chain threat is a little less dominant than it was a month or so ago. Still issues, still parts of the world that are grappling with this, still companies that were decked by the COVID-19 and the government down. But for the most part, you're seeing improvement in that area rather than more difficulty. The government mandated shutdowns has continued. There are now a lot of conversations about restarting, and I'll talk in a lot more detail about that in a minute. No one's quite sure yet how this would play out. One of the suggestions that was coming out of the White House was that certain cities would be allowed to come back to life before others. We would find places where the COVID-19 virus was less of a threat, and those would be opened up. Cities like New York, not so quickly. The challenge with that is going to be the fact that people will tend to move according to where the openings take place, and that could sort of undermine the whole idea of isolating the virus. Approach that's been more common in Europe has been to open things up in stages and to look at, for example, first round would be offices. People could go back to work in their offices because the control environment would be easier to maintain. People are working in cubes and they're working in offices. They can protect themselves better, hygiene, etc. Next phase would be opening up other types of stores. I mean, already we have stores open and we have drugstores open and hardware stores are open and you can buy guns. I mean, so the next step would be open up furniture stores and open up clothing stores. The same rules would apply for those as apply for the ones that are deemed essential now. Third round would probably be restaurants. Again, giving people a little bit more control. Restaurants would have stricter codes when it comes to hygiene, theoretically. And then the very last phase would be the large crowd drawing types of things, sporting events, concerts, entertainment, theme parks, things of that nature. But none of this has really been outlined all that clearly yet. Austria has reopened. Denmark reopened. Finland is getting close to it. Germany is considering being kind of partially reopened by next week. So it's probably going to be hitting the U.S. in the next week or two. Central banks have done all they can do. They're kind of on the sidelines now. They're just going to be maintaining at this stage. Congress has done their first $1 trillion package, $2 trillion package. Now they're talking about the next one. Not necessarily as sure a deal. They're talking about focusing partly on infrastructure, more of an expansion of the loans to small businesses, but there's not been a consensus built around this yet. The earliest that people would probably see that would be the end of this month. And I mentioned earlier, some nations have seen a peak. There is some evidence that you're seeing a peak in Europe as well. Okay. If anyone is listening, if you can give me control over my slides, that would be great, because right now they're not cooperating. Okay. peak has been reached in Europe, maybe. We've seen it in Asia, mentioned this last time, and we've seen peak in China, South Korea, Japan, getting into an area now where they're worried more about secondary and tertiary infections from people who are traveling back into those countries from other places. But we're now also seeing a bit of a recovery in Europe. Italy seems to peak, Germany's hit a peak, France has hit a peak. That's what encouraged the markets earlier this week, feeling that you were now starting to get a decent kind of response in other parts of the world, not just Asia. Okay, so yay, my slides are working again. A couple of quick things, and this is just reiteration of what we've been dealing with up till now. This isn't the flu, but it isn't the death either. It's kind of in between. It is a viral infection that has some characteristics that make it less dangerous than some of the ones we've dealt with in the past, and it makes it more dangerous in other ways. It has more of an RO number, the spread number. It's going to spread faster than the flu. The flu's RO is 1.3. COVID-19 is probably around 2.5, roughly twice as rapid a spreader as flu. The critical thing, and this has really been the issue all along, is incubation time. The positive thing, if one can say that, about the flu is that you know you have it almost right away. Anyone who's had the flu knows this. I mean, from the moment that you will come down with it, it's like, oh God, I'm getting the flu. And within a day or so, yep, you've got the flu, and you're sitting in bed, and you're eating chicken soup, and you're watching old reruns of the Andy Griffith Show, and you know the drill. The trouble with COVID-19 is that you can have the dang thing for 2 weeks before you know you have it. And 60% of the people who get it are asymptomatic. They don't know they have anything. If anything, their throat's a little scratchy. They've got a slight fever. This is allergy season, for crying out loud. There are people all over the country who are like, I feel this way every year. It's just because of the tree pollen. What's this got to do with anything? We don't know because we don't have particularly good testing protocols in place. So people feel punk, and it's like, well, maybe I should go get tested. And then it's like, oh, yeah, well, yeah, stand in line here for the next 12 or 13 hours, and we'll try to let you know within the next 6 or 7 months. What? No, I don't think I'm going to do that. So people just go about their business and end up being carriers. The hospitalization rate's higher, and that's one of the things that's put a lot of stress on the healthcare system. It is a lung ailment, it's an upper respiratory ailment, and it creates a pneumonia-like condition very quickly, and it puts people at risk. That's why it has been more deadly for people who are elderly, people who have compromised immune systems, people who have been smokers, anyone whose lungs are not what they should be. The fatality rate is a little bit less than we thought it was originally. The estimate is anywhere from 1% to 3.4%. Not a whole lot different from flu. Flu is about 1.3, and its worst iterations, this was like the worst flu outbreaks we've had in past years. So, still not getting my slides to move. So, there we go. I think I showed this once before, but just puts things in context. This has been less dangerous than things like MERS and SARS and bird flu and all that sort of stuff, that it spreads faster. It is comparable to some of the snow flus that we've had in the past. So it kind of straddles the line between being dangerous and rapidly spread. And it's the rapid spread part that has been causing the most difficulty. The testing procedure really is the key, at least right now, until vaccines are developed, and we've got nothing to brag about when it comes to this. As recently as mid-March, the testing in the U.S. was 23 per million. So out of every million people, we were testing 23 of them. We are now up around 50, so a little better than it was. But you compare it to places like South Korea, which was testing 3,600 people. And South Korea focused on people who are in the healthcare sector, first responders, people who are the highest risk. Ours has been very haphazard. We weren't ready. We didn't have enough testing kits. We didn't have procedures in place. We didn't even know who was going to do the test. It took us a while to even let private testing take place. And, how are we going to funnel the information? Some communities would test aggressively, others wouldn't. It's just very chaotic. And as we go into that period after this where we review what we did right and what we did wrong, one of the things that will come out is we've got to get a lot better at the testing part. One of the interesting conclusions that has been reached with this and a lot of the other threats that we've dealt with in past years is that democracies have fared better than non-democracies. Non-democracies have had a higher level of infection. They have had faster spread. They've had more fatalities. And when you look at the two systems, it's like, okay, people living in a democracy are not healthier than people who are not living in a democracy. People in democracies are not less subject to viral infection. What it comes down to is information. The more people know about what's going on, the better prepared they are to take care of themselves and to follow instructions. And a lot of what has worked in terms of dealing with this has been information, letting people know what they're supposed to do and why. So a lot of differences in terms of deaths, much higher in places like Spain and Italy. The U.S. is fairly high. South Korea has been low, and Germany has been low. And again, this comes back to the ability to get to the issue relatively quickly. So with that, I think we're going to leave the medical stuff to somebody else and get more into the economics. We know this too. Most countries in the world have done pretty much the same thing we have done, a lot more increase in spending, basically trying to blunt the impact of the shutdown, because obviously we're not the only country that shut down business to deal with the spread of the infection. At the time that this chart was done, we had not come up with our spending bill, and of course we have. So this is fairly universal. Almost everybody has done spending, and few have done tax cuts, few have done market support overtly. Most of the major central banks have done rate cuts, but for now, the first line of defense has been to spend money. And one of the questions that came in even before we started this was whether all of the spending was going to have an impact on inflation. And it probably will by the end of the year. But a couple of things to be aware of. We have been struggling for really the last 5 or 6 years to get inflation up to the level that the Fed wanted it to be. The Fed was trying to get to 2%, and we kept falling short. So we've been in a very low inflation environment for a long time already. Now that we've seen $2 trillion, maybe at the end of the day, $3 or $4 trillion circulating in the economy, that would potentially be enough to start an inflationary spiral, but only if it manifests in the way the consumers react. And some of the things that will continue to dampen inflation will be oil prices. They have obviously fallen like a rock because of demand, but also because of the oil war that the Saudis and the Russians launched against us. If the consumer is not hitting the market as heavily as they have in the past, that inflation may not translate. Companies are going to want to increase their prices. They may not be able to. If the consumer is resistant, well, they're going to have difficulty dealing with that. The inflation, when we get it, is likely to come from commodity side because a lot of production has been shut down. It will take a while for that production to come back. And if there's sufficient demand, take, for example, oil. If suddenly we decide to start demanding oil again, driving again, consuming again, well, a lot of the oil operations have already shut down temporarily at least. those will have to come back online, and you could see the price per barrel of oil shooting back up again. Most are not anticipating this getting much above 80 or 90 bucks a barrel, which would be significant, but nothing like the 140, 150, 160 that we saw even a decade or so ago. The markets took a hit, and they have since recovered, and then took another hit, and then recovered and took another hit. I mean, that's typical behavior of a market that just doesn't quite have a grasp of what to expect from one day to the next. It's reacting to every rumor, to every potential change, every piece of good news, every piece of bad news, set markets off into another tizzy. We are still not in as bad a shape as we were in 2008. You know, one of the things we have to kind of remember is that there's a sense of drama that just pervades the media when you're dealing with something like this. And part of it is that the media is competing for the attention of viewers and readers and competing with other entertainment channels. And, you know, it's the old adage, it bleeds, it leads. So everything is expressed with the most urgency and drama that can be mustered. The 2008-2009 recession was brutal, and it was one that lasted a long time, and this one won't. This is an artificial recession. This is a recession that was created by government edict, and it will end by government edict. Lots of things have to happen once the all clear has sounded, and there are lots of things that could go wrong. But the trigger for this recession was not a financial sector crisis the way it was in 2008. It was not a sudden lack of demand, as played a role in 2008. It was not the fact that we had been through a boom that was, you know, you just think about the years before 2008. The housing market, you know, this is an organization that deals a lot with construction. Everyone realized how out of control that was. I mean, home prices, and it just was absurd because the world had gone into this crazy boom period, which couldn't be sustained. We don't have that this time. I mean, if you look at the line on the left, we weren't in a boom prior to this. There's no boom from which to come down. Look where we were in 2006 and 2007. I mean, that was an overinflated boom period, if ever there was one. So this will not be the kind of recession that drags on for years and years and years. The good news is that it's a short, sharp recession. The bad news is getting out of it is going to depend on some very, very specific behaviors by consumers. Consumers are going to have to accept that the danger is over and get back to their normal pattern. And we think they will, but there's no guarantee. If we look at other countries, they have shown recoveries already. China had a tremendous drop in terms of its purchasing managers index, but came back in this last and is now back into growth period, back above 50. This is probably the pattern that we'll see with most other countries' purchasing managers indices once we've kind of gotten on the other side of the economic shutdown. And the PMI has always been a very reliable indicator because purchasing managers don't fudge. They just report, you know, I bought more of this, I bought less of that, bought the same. It becomes a very good month-to-month record of what's happening in industry. And once people start buying again, well, it's going to be reflected in the PMI almost immediately. The sectors that got hit the hardest in China are the sectors that are being hit hardest in Europe and here. The investment in fixed assets, the stock market activity definitely took a hit. Retail took a hit. The export sector obviously took a hit. Industrial production, services. And then the services were very broad. I mean, it's industrial production is broad enough. Services include everything. I mean, it's retail and it's healthcare and even construction is part of the service designation. So within that category, there's a lot of variability. Another indicator, and we showed this before last time too, The credit managers index looked very stressed, very similarly structured to the purchasing managers index. And the information that we gained from it was kind of interesting because the biggest decline were in the favorable sectors. And I think I mentioned this last time that we break this into two categories, favorable and unfavorable. Favorables are sales, dollar collections, applications for credit, so on. The unfavorables, bankruptcies, disputes, accounts out for collection, slow pays, things of that nature. What's interesting is that all the immediate stuff took a hit. So sales and dollar collections all fell from the 60s into the 40s. So a dramatic decline. The unfavorables didn't show much change yet because there hasn't been time. And this is going to be an interesting timing issue as we go through the summer. There weren't a big increase in bankruptcy or dispute collection or any of those unfavorable categories because these companies aren't in trouble yet. If you had 90 to 120, 180-day terms, well, you've still got 2 or 3 months to pay. You weren't expected to pay in April or May anyway. So if you are back in business by June or late May, you'll be able to make good with your creditors. So there never will be a collection effort. There never will be bankruptcy talk. There never will be necessarily disputes and slow pays. The longer the shutdown lasts, the more likely it is that these become problems. And companies that had 30-day pay or 60 days to pay are feeling the strain already, but those that are a little bit further out have some time. They could escape some of this if you turn around in time. 3 scenarios. Still the most commonly cited, the one that most people are most confident in is the May reboot, that we get through April as the worst month. This kind of the pattern that other countries have been showing. We begin to see serious recovery. Businesses start to reopen in May, and by the end of the year, you have probably seen a contraction in the overall economy of around 1.6%. If that is indeed the case, we escape actual recession, because if we go down by 1.6%, that will not take us into negative territory. We will be close, not anything we want to write home about. We'll be growing at about 0.04, 0.07, under 1 for sure, but that's not formally recession. It's about as close as you can get, but hey, the summertime recovery or a fall recovery will probably create a recession for second quarter, might even leak into third quarter, though there are fewer people who see a third quarter recession. Most are saying if we get one at all, it's going to be second quarter, which is when most of the impact was felt. And then third quarter, we'll be seeing at least a partial recovery. And then by fourth quarter, it could actually be a pretty good quarter depending on how the consumers react to this. If we come out of this with confidence and stored up, pent up energy and trying to make up for lost time, then we can end up with a pretty good fourth quarter. But it's going to depend a lot on attitude. If you look at some of the worst case scenarios in terms of projected growth, you're looking at by next year, global growth being right up to around 3.2%, which is faster than it was in 2019. The U.S. would be bumping along at a little less than 1%. I think this is probably a little too pessimistic, but this is kind of one extreme as far as predictions are concerned. Another one that's a little less, now it's getting stuck again. Here we go. Slightly more optimistic, we're talking about a fairly decent recovery, a fairly short V-shaped recession, so that by 2021, the U.S. is more or less back to normal, around 2% growth, with not exciting, but it's kind of where we've been for the last 20 years. China will be back to a little above 6%. The interesting thing is what happens after that, because when you get into 2022 and 2023, you kind of get a reaction to the slowdown of this year, and it's kind of a delayed reaction. Doesn't really crater anybody, but it kind of slows the growth down to what would have been considered normal patterns maybe a year or so ago. Okay, not really sure why this is working sometimes and not, but hey, that's technology, and it probably knows that I'm the kind of person that misses number 2 pencils and yellow legal pads. Which sectors are at highest risk? Some of these are going to affect your industry. The biggest impact, obviously, has been travel and leisure. Those are the ones that have been really locked down by all of the social distancing and the rest of it. The rest of the country, you can kind of do it from home. You know, an awful lot of companies have done the work at home routine, and they haven't really missed much. But, you know, if you're running a theme park, it's kind of hard to do that from home. If you're running a hotel, well, that's not going to be too useful either. So those sectors are feeling the pinch. The good news is that those are also sectors that would recover quickly. If you are out of this situation by May or June, people will start traveling again. Again, the timing is going to be everything. It's the summer. The summer is the travel season. Summer is vacation season. People may feel like they really, really need a vacation after all this. They may decide that they're going to send their kids to one side of the country and they're going to go to the other side of the country. And so then you'll have 2 sets of hotels focusing. So there's the potential for a pretty rapid rebound for these sectors, even when it comes to employment, because the 7 or 8 million people lost their jobs highly concentrated in these sectors. It's been people in the restaurant business, in the hotel trade, in the airlines, in entertainment. Unlike 2008, 2009, when the majority of the unemployment was higher level financial sector workers, an awful lot of people in manufacturing, these jobs often did not come back. Because if you think back to 2008, 2009, we lost massive companies, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, WAMU. I mean, it's just, it was carnage. And these were jobs that didn't come back. The companies didn't come back. Most of the companies that have been affected by this are kind of in a holding pattern. They don't think they're going to be out of business. They are temporarily locked down. And when the lockdown ends, they fully intend to get back to work. The hotels will hire everyone back. The restaurants will hire back their workers and servers. The theme parks will hire back their people. Not always the same people getting their jobs back, but there's an estimate that 85 to 90% of those who've lost their jobs due to the lockdown will get those jobs back as soon as the lockdown is over. I mentioned this once before too, so the hardest hit job markets, just kind of a reiteration. Any place with a high population, any place that is more than a little dependent on tourism and basically just retail activity in general. Bailout of the century, we talked about this once before as well. Now getting a little bit of a handle on how this is working, and the main challenge is what we predicted it would be, which is the bureaucracy is overwhelmed. These loans are handled through private banks, and the private banks are backlogged, and they are working as quickly as they can, but not all the rules are even clear, and it's taking 2, 3, 4 weeks in some cases for this money to be dispersed. We knew that was going to happen. That's always the case. You had this tremendous demand all at once, and it's going to take a while to sort it out. And bear in mind that the government agencies and the banks are dealing with the same sort of lockdown issues that everybody else is. They're understaffed, and there are people working from home and all of that sort of stuff. So it's not quite the panacea that we hoped it would be, but it's something that will probably be more palpable and kick in more towards the end of this month and into May. Okay, we're still dealing with this. How weird. Okay. A lot of companies still trying to decide how this is playing out for them. 50% roughly think it's going to be a significant and big concern. Others, about a third are like, well, it's really going to hit some parts of the country harder than others, and a good 12% don't really think it's going to affect them at all. So you've got about a 50-50 split. About half the companies in the country are very worried about this. The other half, yeah, they're keeping an eye on it, they're monitoring it, but they're at this point not panicking. Went through these scenarios last time, just kind of an update as to how they're playing out. The virus threat needed to fade. There's some progress as far as Asia and Europe are concerned. Those countries seem to have been reaching a peak. Still have views of reinfection, still have the secondary and tertiary impact from people that are coming back home from areas that have had infections. Consumers still need to prove that they're going to react strongly to this. Right now, confidence levels are falling, but that's what you would expect. People are quite frustrated and they're uneasy about what happens from here. But so far, you're not hearing consumers declare that they don't plan to come back to life. A lot of it is going to be how believable government is when it decides that there's an all clear. There is a huge trust issue right now. The U.S. is not particularly trusting when it comes to its government in many cases anyway, and that trust level is at an all-time low. Countries that have gotten out of this relatively quickly, the Germans, the South Koreans, the Singaporeans, they trust their government. And when the government said go back to work, it's all fine, they're saying, okay, I believe them. Polls indicate that Americans are like, I don't trust any of these people. I hear 15 different interpretations every time anybody opens their mouth. I don't know who I'm supposed to listen to. 1 minute, this group is being extolled and they're doing a hell of a job. The next minute, I hate them. They lie. This guy, the consumer is just like, I don't know who to believe. And I'm very skeptical about everybody at this stage. So that will have to stop. Consumers will have to finally get behind a message. The government is leaving the liquidity measures in place, and there certainly hasn't been time even to implement them, much less remove them. The virus is fading in other markets, a little more progress in Europe right now than in the U.S. And so far, the infrastructure is keeping pace than we thought it would at first. The bad outcome, there are still problems with cooperation. Companies are doing a pretty good job of having people work at home, but there's still resistance to social isolation in some parts of the world, particularly here. Italy is another one that struggled with that. The more, and I hate to say it, but disciplined cultures, the Swedes, the Germans, the South Koreans, they have kind of adopted these new techniques relatively quickly, and they've gotten more outcome than some other countries have. Consumers are still a little nervous, but we won't really know if that's going to play out until summer. We've seen no sign of the government easing up on support. The virus has not spread as much in Europe as we thought it might. It seems to have peaked, and the only infrastructure issue we're dealing with now is really in the healthcare sector. It's continued to be overwhelmed, but only in specific areas. Some cities are not experiencing any real problem at all. New York, on the other hand, is in major crisis level. The ugly outcome, nothing was pointing to that right now. There has been progress in developing a vaccine, and earlier this week, there was a nice little discovery that would be useful for the future. One of the keys to a vaccine is how long it lasts. We know that with the flu vaccine, we have to change it every year, and the flu vaccine is constantly modified because the flu itself constantly modifies. It morphs all the time. Thus far, COVID-19 is to be morphing anywhere from 5 to 6 times slower than the flu. So when a vaccine is developed, the thinking is that it will be effective for multiple years, maybe even as long as a decade, because the COVID-19 change will be minor and slow, and it will allow the vaccine to keep pace. So once we get one, it may be one that lasts for an extended period of time rather than have to be reinvented every year. We haven't seen panic as far as business is concerned. We have not seen the government running out of options yet. There really isn't a sense of worldwide panic, so we're still a long way away from this ugly outcome. We still have economists that are thinking we're going to be somewhere around 1.5, 1.75 by the end of this year, and certainly in that category coming into next year. So a little kind of mention of what's going on the construction side of things, because really it hit from two directions. One, we have seen some progress on. The original challenge for construction was supply chain, and the shipping delays were really messing with a lot of companies' plans and upholding or holding up projects and the like. That has begun to become less of a problem. Now the issue is consumer confidence. Is there going to continue to be desire for residential, which at this point is very hard to judge. One of the anecdotal things that's coming out as far as residential, coming out of the real estate market, is that for the last 10, 15 years, the residential construction people have been worried about millennials and their attitude towards single-family homes. The millennial would express consistently that I want to live in multifamily, loft is fine, apartment is great, don't have a plan to move to the house in the suburbs. There has been an abrupt change, at least as far as the polls are concerned. Millennials are now starting to say, maybe I do want that single family home, and maybe I want a moat, and I want to be as far from my neighbor as I can get. So suddenly the idea of living in a large collection of apartments is not as appealing as it once was. This could be a completely ephemeral situation where people are just reacting to the social isolation call that's in place right now. But if that does translate, then it means more single-family construction going forward. When it comes to the commercial side of things, one of the issues is, will companies continue with this remote workplace? Will there be less desire to build office buildings, and will there be more interest in this sort of work at home mindset? Thus far, the polls that are coming out suggest that people don't like working at home. They thought they would. They wouldn't mind doing it occasionally, but the idea of being in your house day after day after day, not around your colleagues, kind of dealing with all the things it deals with at home, is not as appealing as people thought it would be. I think a lot of the commentary that's been coming in is simply that, how do you escape work? The issue in the past was that you worked at work, and when you were done, you went home, and home was not work. How do you leave work now? Work is there all the time. So you want to avoid the email and the text and the message and the meeting, but it's right there. It's dinging away at you, and it's like, oh, come on, man, it's only 5:30, it's only 6:30, it's only 9:45. Answer my message. And if people are not enjoying it. Now, part of this is just getting used to a new routine, but this could have an impact on the kind of construction that takes place in the not terribly distant future. One of the other areas that is kind of intriguing about all this is the notion of, and I'll get to it here in a minute, who's in the high exposure category, who's in the low exposure category. We talked a bit about high exposure already. Automotive has felt it, apparel, consumer durables, gaming, lodging, all that stuff. I mean, it's retail and it's travel and it's entertainment. The moderate exposure hitting things like business services, the healthcare sector, manufacturing, oil and gas, they've been affected almost indirectly by what's going on in the high exposure areas. And then you have low exposure. Low exposure includes construction and home building. It includes packaging, it includes steel processing, et cetera. So there's lots of areas that have been essentially moving the way they always do. Partly is there hasn't been time to react. And if you're in the middle of a big project right now, you're not going to stop it just because there's been a lockdown imposed for a few weeks. So some of the construction projects are really more delayed than anything else. So the hope is that this continues to be a factor and that the construction trade escapes the worst of this, especially if we see something kind of winding up by end of May, getting into early summer. So the most difficult question, and the one coming, and the one that no government official wants to really deal with at all, is what will be the criteria for calling an end to the lockdown. There will be infections for years. COVID-19 is going to be like every other virus we've dealt with. We get Ebola and Marburg and MERS and SARS and swine flu and avian flu all every year. None of them will ever go away. None of them will ever be eradicated. We spent the better part of 5 decades trying to eliminate smallpox, and it came back last year. So it's impossible to completely control this. What you end up with is a goal of control. You want to create a situation where it is manageable and that you can accept the job. The question then becomes, how many infections can be tolerated? How many fatalities? At what point do you say, we're doing the best we can, we cannot exist anymore, we can't handle any more economic disruption. We're going to have to go back to some semblance of normal. A couple of things just in perspective. The CDC estimates an annual flu burden. They've been doing this for years. Every single year, there's a report that comes out and says this is what's likely to happen as far as flu is concerned. And in a given year, and this was the estimate for this last year, 2019, there would be 9 million to 45 million illnesses, which makes perfect sense. I mean, we all know what flu season is like. We know that it hits all kinds of people. We know that in a population of 340 million people, yeah, it's pretty common that about 45 million of those people are going to get sick with the flu. It happens all the time. Between 140,000 and 800,000 of those will be hospitalized. That's a rate of around 2.7 per 100,000. So it is a relatively slow, small rate of hospitalization in general. Between 12,000 and 61,000 deaths in an average year from just the flu. So if you look at the COVID-19 numbers, so far there's 402,000 confirmed cases, a whole lot less than 9 to 45 million. The rate of hospitalization is 2.5 for people between the ages of 18 and 49. So it's about a little less even than the hospitalization rate for just the flu. It's much, much higher for people over 65, 13.5% per 100,000, and there have been 13,000 deaths so far. So we are already, when it comes to COVID-19, at the low end of the flu deaths that we get in an annual year. So I'm not bringing this up as a way to compare the flu to COVID-19 or to suggest that it's just the flu or any of that sort of thing. It's just that we have reached a point as a culture to accept year after year between 12 and 61,000 deaths from the flu. And dealing with the flu would have been the same as dealing with this. If we wanted to eliminate those potential 61,000 deaths, we could have done what we have done with COVID-19. We could have prohibited people from coming in contact with each other. We could have been practicing social distancing, because you get the flu the same way you get COVID-19. It is a virus that is picked up from contact, but we don't. We just simply say, yeah, this is one of the dangers. You might get the flu. You need to protect yourself. We have sort of shifted the burden over the years for things like the flu and a lot of other diseases to the individual. If you think you are at risk, well, behave accordingly. Stay away from people that have the flu. So this is going to be an incredibly awkward question. It's going to be one of these things where the government's going to have to get up and say, we've done the best we can. It's not going to get any better. There are still going to be infections. There are still going to be deaths, but we think that there are few enough infections and few enough deaths that we can go back to normal. And almost immediately, you're going to have somebody, as soon as we go back to normal, that says, oh my God, I have a relative that got this and died. Would we stop trying to control COVID-19? Well, we didn't stop. It's just that you get to a trade-off point, and it's going to be a really, really tough conversation. And I don't really know how that's going to play out. So again, we're shifting. We now know that the value of things. Now, one interesting commentary on toilet paper. I had a colleague write back to me and say, hey, I know one of the reasons we have a toilet paper shortage. And I hadn't thought about this before, but about 40% of the toilet paper that is produced in the United States is produced for industrial purposes. This is the toilet paper that you see in public restrooms and you see in kind of industrial institutional settings. And we all know that this is not the kind of toilet paper we have at home. This is institutional stuff, which is not very comfy and all that. Totally different factories make that toilet paper as make the stuff for home. And for the last whatever decades, a good 45% of production went into institutional. Now everybody is staying home and they're not using that toilet paper. So we actually have a surplus of industrial strength toilet paper, which we can't use at home because the rolls don't fit the rollers and all the rest of that stuff. So there, everything you always wanted to know about toilet paper shortages, but we're afraid to ask. As mentioned earlier, we're going to have to take some time for questions, and if you have others, please feel free to send me emails, call me, we can take it there. So we are now going to jump into the question. I think Aisha and others are going to read them out so we can get to them and go from there.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That was extremely insightful, especially having the surplus of toilet paper, even if it's industrial, it helps. Okay, we actually have a question. How can we resume face-to-face activities and customer interactions if a vaccine has not been developed? I think you kind of answered that towards the end, but if you could just go over it again.
Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a judgment call because we have all gotten used to dealing with the different cold and flu viruses that we contend with every year. And frankly, you're going to have to respect or rely on the people you're interacting with, because in order for us to be protective, we're going to have to pay attention to our own health. And if we think we're a risk, behave as such and stay away from people. We've all seen over the years the person who just, by God, they're going to go to work and just show that they're tough. They're going to show up and sneeze and cough and carry on. It's like, now we need to look at those people and say, you evil person, go home. I do not want your disease. But we're just going to have to be cautious. The face-to-face type things, well, we may have to get used to being a little further away from each other and frantically rubbing our hands with hand sanitizer the whole time that we're talking.
Okay. I'm going to again ask the attendees to please post their questions in the question box. We are receiving them from some of the members, and we are waiting for others to post their questions. Another question that I have now, and I think that refers to the last slide about COVID data comparing to flu season numbers, is that isn't this COVID data on top of flu season numbers?
No, so far they're not mixing the two. That's because this is fairly new. All the flu data that you're getting is from 2019. So as they are trying to look at flu and COVID-19, the challenge going forward is going to be separating the two and saying, okay, they're both upper respiratory because we are dealing with the flu at the same time that we're dealing with COVID-19. Obviously, they're different viruses. They can be identified differently, but only if they're tested as such. And going forward, there's going to be a lot of energy put into separating those out and trying to figure out, of the people that died of a respiratory ailment, what exactly was the cause. Because COVID-19, flu, and many others basically kill you the same way. I mean, they're creating a pneumonia within the lungs, and it could be a number of factors. Right now, the assumption is, okay, we're going to think it's COVID-19 until proven otherwise. Last year, it was, oh, we think this is flu until proven otherwise. So it's going to be a test.
Okay. Another question is, was the oil and gas patch already dealing with a downturn prior to the pandemic, and how much has the pandemic worsened this?
Yeah, the pandemic has made it a little worse because it affected demand. But the real crisis for oil and gas started with the oil war. We were hanging in there as far as demand is concerned until the Saudis and the Russians lowered the price of oil and stepped up production, trying to get their market share back. That's when you saw the huge collapse in oil prices. Without that oil war, the estimate would have been probably 45 to 50 bucks a barrel. So you're probably looking at around a $20 to $30 impact from the oil war. Now, both of those countries have begun to back off a little bit, but they're still pressuring when it comes to production. They're behaving like business people at this stage. They're trying to crush their rivals, and they're taking advantage of our bad situation.
Okay. Another question is if I self-quarantine for 14 days, is it safe to visit my parents?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to with self-quarantining is trying to figure out if you've been exposed to something, and that's because of the incubation period. We don't know for sure. The only way that one knows for sure that they are free of this is to be tested. And if you are tested and you are found to be carrying the COVID-19 virus, then you're going to have to go through some kind of an incubation period, and that's why it's 14 days. The challenge is getting that test, and there are lots and lots of places now that are doing the test. They're now private as well as public, but they're quite overwhelmed. If you have a concern and you want to do some visiting in the not too distant future, try to get yourself on the list tested sooner than later.
Got it. Another question, what impact do you expect from the $600 per week extra unemployment benefit that the government is issuing as it relates to the economy, again, attracting enough workers?
Yeah, that's probably going to be the bigger impact from this $2 trillion than that $1,200 check, because it extends people's unemployment benefits. There are some concerns that people are going to just take their unemployment check and not work. That's really never been a factor. There are certainly people that play the system, and they always have, and they always will. The vast majority of the people who have lost their jobs in the last couple of weeks want their jobs back. They don't want to lose their opportunity to make a living. They certainly understand that sooner or later those unemployment checks run out, and then they're right back where they started. The vast majority of those who've been polled are saying, yeah, thanks a lot for the unemployment. I want my job back, and I want my job back as quickly as I can get it. So I don't think we're going to see a large percentage of people deliberately staying out of the workforce.
Okay. Another one is, what are you hearing in terms of transportation, and if this industry is badly hit, and how much will that hurt supply chain recovery?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been a lot of short-term damage. My sense is that this will be one of the sectors that turns around pretty quickly once you get a lifting of the restrictions. So the advice that I'm hearing, particularly within manufacturing circles and construction circles and others, is kind of hold on for another month and hope that we get a turnaround the way we've seen it in other countries, and that we start to see a resumption of normal activity, at least in a phase or two. We may have to wait a while to see the big crowd type things come back, but other types of businesses should be able to come back to life in May.
Okay, great. And another one is it's probably from one of your first slides, is why does Fed want inflation?
What was that one again? You cut out just towards the end.
Why does Fed want inflation?
Oh, the Fed wants inflation primarily because you don't have an opportunity as a producer to raise your prices at all if there's no inflation at all in the system. One of the things that we don't think a lot about is deflation, where prices don't change. And under a deflationary environment, producers can't raise their prices at all. Employees can't get higher wages. Everything just stagnates because there's no upward movement. You want a little bit of inflation kind of to grease the wheels so that there's enough activity to stimulate decent price increases. Companies can increase profits a little bit. Employees can think about getting a wage hike, getting promotions, etc. You just don't want it to get carried away. 2%, 2.5% is considered acceptable, normal, and useful. You get up to around 3, 3.5%, 4%, now you've got issues. And so the Fed is always trying to walk this really fine line, saying, I don't want it to be low, don't want it to be too high. It's got to be right here in the middle, and it's hard to hit that fine line.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions now. Okay, what is the consensus on how long the virus has been in the U.S.?
It's hard to tell exactly when it arrived because we're not really sure when it began to appear in other parts of the world. Coronavirus is kind of a catch-all name for a cold virus, so it's really a morphed cold virus more than anything else. What made it very deadly and challenging is that it was originally a virus found in animals and made the jump to humans probably in December, maybe November of last year. One of the issues that will continue to haunt is that China was not working at all with the information that they had. They knew this was becoming a problem in November and December. It was even in January that they were still trying to deny how bad the situation was in Hubei province. The data that's coming out of China now is a lot more trustworthy than it was because now you have every health agency on the planet in China. I mean, the CDC is there, WHO is there, Japanese Ministry of Health, European Ministry of Health, they're all there. They're the ones now who are collecting the data. And so the data that's coming out today is far more reliable than what you saw a month or two ago. But that delay in being able to deal with this was a problem because it got carried away in China. Same thing happened here because we didn't really react to its arrival until it had been here for several weeks. I think the first reported cases were in Seattle, and that was in late January, early February. But then as we started actually looking for it, it's like, oh my God, it's all over the place. So it has spread quickly because it is a virulent virus. It spreads faster than even the flu.
Okay, another one. Where does oil go by quarter 3 and quarter 4?
It depends a lot on demand. The demand should start to come back when the summer months arrive, and it could come back fairly strongly because it's vacation season, it's driving season. We all know that there's a lot more consumption of fuel during those months. So if that does take place, you will probably see a pretty abrupt increase in demand, which would push prices up. But the other critical thing is we need to find a way to back Saudi Arabia and Russia down. There was a hint at one point, Trump said that we were having talks with both these countries, but then the Saudis and Russians immediately said, no, we're not. We're not talking to anybody. We're not going to cut our price. Yeah, I don't know who you're talking to, buddy, but it's not us. They see this opportunity to crush a major rival. The U.S. replaced them as the world's leading oil producer, and they didn't like it and still don't. So I'm guessing 50, 60 bucks is probably going to be the upper limit if demand comes back. Possibly if we get some kind of a settlement with those other countries, it could get up to the 70 or 80 buck a barrel range. But if we don't get a return in demand and we don't get a settlement with them, it could stay down in the 40s and 30s.
Okay. Another one is, when do you believe the sales force can begin to travel again?
Probably the same timeline as a lot of the other stuff. We're probably looking at a May recovery. That's going to be the critical month. We know that April is kind of a lost cause. We know that this is the peak month. We know that nothing significant is going to change in April. Now all eyes are going to be on May. And if we begin to see a recovery, we'll see it in the early to mid part of May. And by the end of the month, we'll feel like we've either turned the corner significantly and are kind of back to normal, or we're in for a long summer-long slog.
Okay. Another one is, do you see a larger correction in the stock market later this month or May?
I don't think we're going to see any huge corrections at this point. We're going to see a lot of volatility because now you're seeing investors who are responding to every little nuance, whether it's good news or bad news. I mean, all it took was for Austria to say it was going to reopen its businesses, and the market said, Europe is back, yay! And it's like, well, no, not quite yet, but it's heading that way. I think we have seen the big bottoming out, and from here on out, it's going to be bouncing around at that lower level, and maybe looking at something of a run a little later in the summer when normalcy begins to return, because you've still got all the contrarians out there who are saying most of the companies that have lost a lot of their emphasis in the last few weeks, they're all going to come back. The airlines are not going to stay down. The hotels are not going to stay down. You know, Disney World is not going to go out of business, and those stocks are being dumped. And the Warren Buffetts of the world are going, really? Do you people still not understand why I'm so rich? So you're going to be seeing the contrarians storming back and profit taking at various intervals.
Okay. What will the impact on luxury versus normal products? We sell luxury faucets. Will people switch to normal items or postpone the luxury purchases?
You know, the luxury items will probably come back a little faster than some of the others because you're talking about people who have the wherewithal to spend, and they have really not declined considerably even all. The areas that have seen the most decline within retail have been the sort of ordinary purchases from ordinary people who are worried about their jobs or who have lost their jobs, the people who are still in good shape. And remember that most of the high-paid, high-sector jobs, they just shifted to working at home. I mean, if you're a high-priced lawyer, it's not like you can't go to work. You just work from home, and you're making money anyway. We have seen actually an increase in, boat sales. There have been a significant increase in private planes. People who are in a position to do it are saying, well, I don't know that I want to get back on a commercial airplane anytime soon, so I think I'll buy my own and just do some private flying. So I think you're going to see a really wide divergence between people who have protected income and can still spend it, and those who are worried about having lost a job or getting that job back or dealing with a financial setback. Even the higher-end restaurants are anticipating a recovery faster than the sort of family restaurant.
Right. Do you see the market going much lower, a U-shaped recovery?
I don't think it is going to go much lower, and if it does, it would stay relatively stable right after that. I think every time there's a piece of bad news, the markets will react. Every time there's a piece of good news, the markets will react. And what constitutes good, bad news is going to change from day to day. I mean, the markets, for example, in Britain immediately responded when Boris Johnson went into ICU. But then the very next day, they're like, well, really, what difference does that make? If Dominic Raab is running things or Boris Johnson is running things, okay, so we're going to come back. Well, who knows? I mean, it's what people feel emotionally from day to day, and the markets right now are really being driven by emotion.
Yeah, I agree with that one. The last question that we've received, and I can answer to that, is can you email the slide presentation to attendees? We are actually uploading the recordings of the webinars, and after next week, which will be the final webinar, we will be putting the slides up on my ASA. So all the attendees will have access to it.
And just remember that if you have further questions or something comes to you in the middle of the night, just email me. I am as long-winded in print as I am in person. So you can clog your inbox up with all of my pithy comments. So.
Lovely. I think you should go and enjoy some nice tea with honey now. You've been speaking for a long time.
It is interesting doing webinars because I've been doing these now in front of my cats for about 2 weeks, and they're utterly bored. They don't care. They're like, what's this got to do with me? But if I can somehow work in references to food, then they suddenly get all excited.
We a lot of attendees are getting. I would get excited too if you talk about food.
There you go.
Yes. Anyways, thank you so much for your time, Chris, and thank you everyone for attending the webinar. I will be sending out a survey shortly, probably in the next couple of hours. Please look out for it and give us your feedback. Everyone have a wonderful day, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Take care. Bye.
You're welcome. Thanks.